This verdict is a step. It's a popping of the lock to be able to get to the place where we can open the door and really start to do the work to save lives.
11 months after George Floyd died, the country is taking a small step toward ending systemic racism in the U.S. Derek Chauvin was convicted on all charges. That small step could help save Black and brown lives, but is sadly coming too late for many who died at the hands of police officers.
Today, I am announcing that the Justice Department has opened a civil investigation to determine whether the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing. I know that justice is sometimes slow, sometimes elusive, and sometimes never comes. The Department of Justice will be unwavering in its pursuit of equal justice under law. We undertake this task with determination and urgency, knowing that change cannot wait.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. We begin in Minneapolis today, where there is renewed discussion about race and policing following the guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin. The former Minneapolis police officer is now facing up to 40 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd last May. He was found guilty on all charges, including second and third degree murder, as well as second degree manslaughter. CBS News correspondent Jamie Yuccas has been covering this trial from Minneapolis since it began.
The jury in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty.
After only about 10 hours of deliberation, the jury found Derek Chauvin guilty of all charges in the killing of George Floyd. The ex-police officer showed no emotion, even as he was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom and taken into custody. Meanwhile, cheers erupted from the Floyd family as the verdict was read. The excitement turned into tears as the relief sank in.
I said I have faith that he will be convicted. It's been a long journey.
George Floyd's brother, Philonis, gave emotional testimony during the trial. He says this is only the beginning of the fight for justice for his family and other Black Americans who don't see a guilty verdict.
I'm going to put up a fight every day because I'm not just fighting for George anymore. I'm fighting for everybody around this world.
And justice to the Floyds means change. Change that only comes from the very top.
I think a John is coming. My dad is going to change the world. He's going to start to change it now.
President Biden called Floyd's family after the verdict was read and later addressed the nation with Vice President Harris. They advocated for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would ban chokeholds and qualified immunity for officers.
The president and I will continue to urge the Senate to pass this legislation, not as a panacea for every problem, but as a start. This work is long overdue.
Nothing can ever bring their brother, their father back, but this can be a giant step forward in the march toward justice in America.
Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison says the victory his prosecutors secured is only a ripple in what needs to be a tidal wave of change.
I would not call today's verdict justice, however, because justice implies true restoration. But it is accountability, which is the first step towards justice.
We have to march. We will have to do this for life. We have to protest because it seems like this is a never-ending cycle.
For more on this, I want to bring in Rebecca Roiphe and Judith Browne Dianis. Rebecca Roiphe is a CBS News legal contributor, and Judith is a lawyer, civil rights advocate, and executive director of the Advancement Project's National Office. Welcome to both of you. Great to have you with us. Rebecca, let me start with you. Chauvin will be sentenced in 8 weeks. Walk us through, again, the charges and what sentence you think he may receive based off of a conviction on all 3 charges.
Sure. So He was convicted on 3 charges, but the sentences for these charges will run at the same time. So really the relevant question is the sentence he faces for the most serious of those crimes, and that's the second-degree murder crime. Now, Minnesota is a sentencing guidelines state, which means that there is a maximum. The maximum for this crime is 40 years, but that's a little bit deceptive because the guidelines are a legislative provision based on the nature of the offense and nature of the offender, just some rough outline, that actually picks a target that's much lower in this case of 12 and a half years. So that's the benchmark. Then the judge will hear in a couple of weeks, or I think a couple of months, will hear arguments from both the defense and the prosecution. The prosecution will argue that there were aggravating factors, things like the vulnerability of the victim, the abuse of government authority, the fact that there were children who were observing this crime, and that should make the judge, they'll argue, give a higher sentence than that 12.5 years. The defense will argue for some mitigating factors. You know, he has accepted responsibility, or they might look at some other factors and suggest he should get a lower sentence. But if he gets that target, 12.5 years, then in Minnesota, 2/3 of that would be served in prison and 1/3 of it would be served on parole. So, you know, roughly about 8 years in prison, but we have to wait until there's that sentencing in which those arguments are made, and we'll see what the judge does.
Really, really interesting. So, Judith, now that we have seen the trial unfold, and the amount of evidence with it, namely the video evidence, I want to read part of the original police report from that deadly day last May. It reads, officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. Now, we know that that is full of all kinds of untruths. So what does it say that this police report was so different from the reality of what happened?
Well, this speaks to the issue of the veracity of police officers. It speaks to what we call the blue wall of silence, where police officers do things to cover up for themselves. Including lying on police reports. It's done all the time. And I think one of the things that we should take away from this case is just how the system of policing is problematic. From the police report to the fact that someone was being criminalized for passing a $20 fake bill, to the first time that they walked up to the car, and Officer Lane pointed a gun at the head of George Floyd. Instead of saying, "Sir, can we talk for a minute?" he brought out his gun. And so this really exposes what happens in policing and how it plays out for Black communities. And so I am hoping that Americans will wake up to the idea that policing is not equal in this country, and that most of what we see in terms of mass incarceration is because of this type of interaction with Black people.
And that video, which was able to tell us so much about what actually transpired that day. Rebecca, as we know, there were 3 other officers at the scene of George Floyd's death, in addition to Derek Chauvin. They will face trial later this year on aiding and abetting charges. What will you be watching for when those trials get underway?
Well, in a way, this conviction has made it a bit harder for the defense attorney in that case, because there are 2 things that the defense is going to want to suggest. One thing they can argue is that there was no, or they could have argued was that there was no principle, there was no crime here. George Floyd died of natural causes. It will be, I think, hard to make that argument with a straight face after the conviction. So that leaves them with one argument, really, which is that the aiding and abetting, the assistance wasn't there, that these officers were giving no assistance to what it was that Derek Chauvin was doing to George Floyd, to the murder. And you know, it's really not all that hard to show aiding and abetting. You don't have to show that somebody was involved in the most, you know, heinous parts of the crime. They were just giving some material support. So I am wondering whether or not one or more of those officers might choose to plead guilty. That's entirely possible. I know that they tried to have their to have the case moved. I assume they will renew that and try again, suggesting that it'll be impossible to get a fair trial in Hennepin County. And one other thing is they also tried to get the case separated so that each one of them would be tried separately, and they lost that motion. But perhaps they might try to renew that in light of their having fewer defenses, that it would be easier to cast blame on others if they were being tried separately. I don't know how successful that will be, but maybe they'll renew that motion.
And Judith, the Justice Department, as we learned, is opening an investigation into the policing practices in Minneapolis. Do you think that this case could bring change not only in Minneapolis, but across the country?
Well, I do think that there will be some change. And that change is that, first of all, Americans have seen how policing works out, as I talked about before. Two is that we are ready to have a conversation in this country now about the liability of police officers for their actions. And so I'm hoping that it will also lead to passage of parts of the Justice and Policing Act, which would get rid of qualified immunity, which is the protection that police officers have to escape liability over and over again. So now we know excessive use of force is a problem. If you didn't know it before, many of us did, and that we should not shield police officers from liability. And so I think those will be some of the top things that we will see. But we have a lot of work to do to change the way in which we have safety in our communities. And we do have to listen to the communities that feel like police do not keep us safe. And let's start thinking about what the alternatives are so that people don't have to fear for their lives. And we understand that when white people may experience protect and serve, but Black people experience law and order, and that is no way to live in our communities.
Judith, Browne, Dianis, and Rebecca Roiphe, thanks to both of you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.